joined by Miranda Yaver with our segment we're going to try to do every week called What's on the Ballot with Miranda Yaver. And Miranda is a political scientist and postdoctoral scholar at UCLA. She is an expert in constitutional law and public health policy, and she's live with me this morning. Good morning, Miranda.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming, and we had such a fun time last week. I thought we have to have you on again and make this a regular thing. So we're joined by Pablo de la Hoya, Ari Lott, Mark Goldman, all saying hello from across the country. So let's get started on what's on the ballot this week. And I wanted to touch on a few things, but we have a couple bills just across the country. I wanted to give you just some general time to talk about affirmative action and some other important issues. Would you give us just a sampling of some major ballot initiatives that are coming up in the United States?
Absolutely. So California is looking to repeal Prop 209. So Prop 209 was passed in 1996. I believe, and this prohibited the consideration of race in publicly funded programs. So that meant that when you applied to the University of California, they were no longer allowed to consider your race in admissions. And I know that this will shock you, but this did not result in the preservation of a ton of racial diversity in University of California schools. In fact, one estimate that was on the University of California President website estimated that it resulted in a 12% decline in underrepresented groups being admitted. And that's really unfortunate. And so on the ballot this year, they're looking to repeal that measure, which would allow the consideration of race in college admissions. Obviously, because of Supreme Court decisions, it can't be the reason why someone gets in, but it can be one of many factors, again, if this proposition is approved by the voters.
Yeah, I'm a former UC student, and I know that even when I was a student at the University of California, Berkeley, the representation was very alarming in terms of different minority groups to a degree where it was shocking, just anecdotally, to a lot of people, and here we are. I graduated college in 2007, so we're here 13 years later.
Oh, so we were at Cal 2 years apart.
Oh yeah?
Yeah. And yeah, it's basically, you're white or you're Asian, essentially there. And the percentage of Hispanic and African American students is really small. And both in terms of improving economic outcomes through education equity, as well as helping to prepare people to be in a diverse workforce. Preparing white students to be working in a more pluralistic society. It disadvantages a lot of people having such a homogeneous student body.
Absolutely. So. And speaking of that, there is a ballot initiative called Measure J that is up on the California ballot this year, and it's sort of an extension of what we've been seeing happen really since May, when the murder of George Floyd in Wisconsin prompted Black Lives Matter protesters to really take the national limelight in their calls for racial justice. And a popular refrain of the Black Lives Matter movement has been defund the police, which of course has been sort of misconstrued and used as a hot, a propaganda point really by the conservative right wing. But the Measure J, would you care to talk about a little bit about what this ballot is in terms of reallocating funds towards social-based services?
Yeah, absolutely. So, full disclosure, I was involved in the Black Lives Matter protests in Los Angeles. So, take with
full disclosure, so was I. Everybody.
Yes, exactly. Actually got arrested at one of them for peacefully marching just a little bit past curfew. So that was an experience. But basically, one thing that's worth emphasizing before we get into the weeds of Measure J is the percentage of the LA city budget that goes to police. And, some people, when I ask people to guess, some people are like, oh, maybe a quarter, maybe a third. It's 54%. 54% of the Los Angeles city budget was going toward the police, which is a really astonishing figure considering the number of challenges that the city faces in terms of homelessness and healthcare and other kinds of programs. And so what Measure J essentially does is it takes the unrestricted funds, about, I think it was 400 million. I could be wrong on that, but I think that was what I saw.
Dollars.
And it diverts them towards social programs that would really benefit communities of color. But basically, it would go toward things like job training and mental health and housing. And this is, and I think that people think about a false dichotomy between we are funding public safety or we're funding social services. But at the end of the day, if we have people who are housed instead of on the streets, they are going to, and if we have people who have mental health care, they're not going to be in the kinds of, you're not going to see nearly as many people in the kinds of mental health crises or economic desperation that leads people to interact with the criminal justice system.
Yeah, and I'll note, the problem is not just in Los Angeles, and it's really all over states. There's a group in Orange County called the People Budget Orange County that is trying to raise attention for their budget, their county's discretionary budget, and the way that they've allocated to their sheriff's department. And that down in Orange County, California, they're starting plans to build a I believe $300 million mental health, because they want to start putting people with mental illness in jail. So the amount of funds being allocated and distributed towards really punishing and criminalizing mental illness is really, I think, what put this group over the top. And so they're calling for a redistribution of funds. We have a comment from Renegade Falco, which I think is a very good one to address. Defund the police means defund the police, LOL. Do you care to respond to that in terms of what the defund the police calls are really about? Because as we know,
yeah, so I mean, I think that there are different understandings of defund the police, and I don't think that I'm the right person to say which one is better or worse, because at the end of the day, I'm not of the demographic that is being most acutely affected by these problems. Some people are calling for the abolishing the police. But a lot of the movement has been about redirecting funds from over-policing to essentially saying, we need housing, we need healthcare, we need job training. We need to have a fairer system so that people who are in these difficult circumstances aren't being criminalized, they're getting help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the more popular,
more realistic aim as well, I would argue.
One of the more, I guess, realistic interpretations of it that I've heard, and of course I agree with you that we maybe not the people to ask, but is that it's not about abolitionism. It's about taking certain funds set aside for the police departments that want. These are services the police don't even want to be really responsible for, and taking that.
They're not mental health experts, and so. Calling a cop for someone who's having a really a schizophrenic who is maybe misbehaving in public, this could be construed by some people as a public safety issue, but at the end of the day, they need someone with psychiatric training, and they're not the person who we should be calling. And instead, when they interact with the criminal justice system, they end up getting in jail instead of in treatment. And I don't think it's fun for anyone to have to deal with that when they're ill-equipped to do so.
Yeah, 100%. So in other news, we've heard a lot of coming out. So I want to take this to the 2020 U.S. presidential. We've got Donald Trump, the president of the United States, really saying some very problematic things in terms of accepting the outcome of the presidential election. We know that he has said that he wants to negotiate, his words, this is a direct quote, negotiate a third term, which is, of course, flagrantly unconstitutional. And he's got people, some of his advisors saying he shouldn't step down. Some people say that there will be an armed insurrection if he loses. He's already trying to cast doubt over the outcome of mail-in balloting. So what exactly happens, Miranda, if the president of the United States loses the election and refuses to concede, which of course would be unprecedented?
Yeah, we're dealing with a lot of unprecedented territory right now, and obviously for a lot of people on the left, the nightmare scenario is that Trump wins, but that's not the nightmare scenario that keeps me up at night. The nightmare scenario, in my mind, is that Biden wins, but not by enough of a majority in the swing states to be immune from voter fraud allegations that Trump can play up and cast doubt on the legitimacy and then make it so that we don't have a peaceful transition of power. And a peaceful transition of power is essential to American democracy. It is, it's really important to emphasize just how unprecedented all of this is. And we can think about, it's amazing how easy it has been to sort of romanticize the 2000s because, George W. Bush, lied to get us into a war and he crashed the economy. But I don't think that there was any doubt in 2004 that if Ohio had gone in the other direction, that he would have stepped down. And that makes it really different. So one thing that the Democrats need to focus on is debunking myths of voter fraud. So voter fraud is such a tiny, tiny percentage of votes. And we know this because A, it's hard to get people to vote once. And B, you're talking about risking time in prison to cast one extra ballot. When one of the first statistical things that we often learn in political science is what are the odds that your vote is going to determine the election, and surprise, surprise, it's not very much. So debunking the myths of voter fraud is going to, whenever this comes up, and even if it becomes really repetitive, I think it is really important to get the message across that voting is legitimate. It is legitimate whether you're voting in person or whether you are voting by early ballot, that receiving an absentee ballot in the mail does not make it voter fraud, even if you didn't cast it, even if you didn't receive it, request the ballot, because voter fraud would be voting twice and not just receiving an extra ballot or something like that. Another thing is voting and making sure that other people vote up and down the ballot to make sure that there is a large enough coalition in power who will be able to check the president's authority if he tries to pull anything, and to make it such a commanding lead that it won't be vulnerable to dismissing it as being the result of voter fraud, as opposed to, hey, maybe people don't like it when you try to kill 200,000 people from coronavirus.
And I'll note that the studies on this have been done. The Heritage Foundation, which is a right-wing conservative organization, found that there were 31 convictions for vote-by-mail fraud in the United States from the year 2000 on. It's extremely rare, 0.00025%, or something. I might have been added or taken away a zero, but it's very, very low.
Yeah, and a political science study found 35 cases of in-person voter fraud out of 1 billion votes cast. And so, the things that we're talking about, that the president is talking about to delegitimize any loss on his part, are so minute. And ironically, the one prominent case of voter fraud that we've seen recently was in North Carolina, and it was by a Republican.
Well, there you go. So a lot of people also are speculating, and Nancy Pelosi has speculated that two things. One is, if the election happens and Joe Biden wins, then Donald Trump might claim that there's fraud, but that doesn't mean that the transition doesn't happen, and he might be physically in the White House, but Joe Biden will be inaugurated. The other thing that people speculate is that if there is a contest in terms of who the outcome has been delivered to, that Nancy Pelosi, through the through the line of succession, will become president of the United States. Is there any truth to that, or is that a myth in terms of the constitutional succession?
Sorry, can you repeat the last claim? So one thing that we know is the Biden would become inaugurated if he won, regardless of what Trump is saying. I think that there would be a cloud of illegitimacy. Can you repeat the
second scenario that's been presented is if there is some sort of challenge to the outcome, maybe perhaps legally, and there is not a president inaugurated on January 21st, that through the presidential line of succession, that Nancy Pelosi then becomes president. Is that a myth, or is there truth to that?
I mean, I think my understanding is that a new president is going to be inaugurated in
no matter. Okay.
And so, whether Trump officially concedes, the concession speech is not what makes the election end.
Right.
It's getting the number of votes in the Electoral College. And so, there could be ongoing litigation, but if the states have declared that the vote winners of the Electoral College exceed that which Joe Biden would need, then my understanding is he gets inaugurated, and whether people view his win as legitimate or not. And I think that this issue of legitimacy is more than just perception, because it means that the policies that he enacts won't have as much public support, and we do require some public support for the healthy functioning of a programmatic agenda.
Yeah, and we know that really was the intention of the Russian misinformation campaign in 2016, because everyone, including the Russians, including Trump, believed Hillary would win. They didn't believe that they would actually succeed at picking it off. And so we know that the majority of that campaign was about casting doubt over the legitimacy of the election once she did win, so that she would have less public support on her side. At least that was my reading of the Mueller report.
Yeah, I agree. And, it's astonishing because, as we talked about last week, we already have electoral institutions that we ourselves designed to make it so that people don't already feel like their vote matters. There are enough people in New York, California, and Texas who are already like, well, I already know how my state's going to go, so my vote doesn't matter. So we already have institutions that are designed by the United States to undermine, a feeling of efficacy in the political process. And now we have someone in power who's manufacturing this sense of illegitimacy. And one thing that I want to add is a huge difference between 2016 and 2020. Is 2016, the President Trump said in the third debate that he wasn't sure if he would concede if he lost. He said, "I will keep you in suspense." But right now, what's different is that even though he is taking these same tactics, he has the powers of the presidency behind him. And we have the Department of Justice essentially going along with it. And it's really easy to forget, looking at how Bill Barr acts, that he's not the personal attorney to the president. He's the Attorney General of the United States. But he's not exactly acting like it. And so I think that we also need to be cognizant of the fact that this isn't just a rehashing of the 2016, will he concede or will he not? It's will he concede when he has the full powers of the presidency behind him.
We got a lot of morning, Miranda. Christopher Drago says we should start all votes matter. LOL. Stoic Sultras is coming in from the UK saying the American people sadly have to look like idiots because of their creepy leader. Can't say much on this side though with the UK. Good point. Another comment from Christopher Drago. Funny is it's not for him to accept or not accept. let's see.
Exactly, which really goes to my point of it's not really about the concession speech. The concession speech goes to this norm of this peaceful transition and accepting the results, whether you win or lose. But it really comes down to, does he have enough electoral votes?
And we will see. That's all the time we've got this morning on the AM Report with Alex Mahajer for HAPS News, the network of Now. I've been joined this morning with Miranda Yaver. She's a political scientist and postdoctoral scholar at UCLA. Where can people find you, Miranda, and support you?
They can find me on Twitter at Miranda Yaver. I'm there a lot. I will respond to you, so feel free to reach out. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Wonderful. If you love this content, if you enjoyed this content and this journalism, please consider sponsoring it. Buy me a cup of coffee, or coffee, one or the other. I'll take both. Visit me at haps.tv/@AlexMahajer. And we're live every weekday morning at 7:30 a.m. Pacific, 10:30 Eastern. And we will see you next week with some very exciting guests coming up. And thank you for all the positive comments. Christopher Drigo says, love you all, the Miranda.
I should just added the to my name. I like it. The Miranda.
Yeah,
I like it.
Monosyllabic now. I love that. All right. Have a good morning. We'll talk to you guys next week.